right, everybody, good morning. Let's get started. Welcome. Thank you for joining us to experience Linux Foundation initiatives supporting the EU Cyber Resilience Act. My name is Hilary Carter. I lead research at the Linux Foundation. I'll take a few moments to introduce myself. I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues Mirko Boehm from LF Europe and Christopher Robinson from the Open Source Security Foundation. I'll let them introduce themselves more fulsomely in a few moments. But I've had the honor and privilege of working with both Mirko and Krob in my research capacity, where at the LF we've published a host of unique insights into open source challenges, opportunities, trends, and many of which are specific to cybersecurity and securing software supply chains. So I invite you all to explore these resources. Our publications are available under Creative Commons. I have a research background. I previously led a think tank that was specific to blockchain technology and have a career that began in financial services. So I'm somewhat of a generalist, excuse me, based in Toronto, Canada, and I host I'm so sorry, I'm tired, I'm jet lagged, but I'll try to speak clearly. I have dual Irish citizenship, and so what happens in Europe resonates very deeply with me personally. So thank you for indulging me in that personal introduction. Let's talk a little bit about the Cyber Resilience Act and how it is consequential for our work here at the Linux Foundation, for our open source communities, for manufacturers. It really does represent a pivotal shift in cybersecurity regulation for several reasons. Very briefly, for those of you unfamiliar with the CRA, the Act has created distinct roles for manufacturers and for open source software stewards, organizations, open source projects that provision software on the market, though they do not commercialize it. Yet, regardless of the distinct roles, all stakeholders need to prepare for the CRA and do so quickly. The Act goes into full force in 2027. So that's what's catalyzing a lot of the activity at the Linux Foundation and within project communities and within organizations as well. The clock is ticking. Today I'm joined by two experts on CRA and CRA activations with whom I've collaborated closely. Mirko Boehm's the Senior Director of Community at LF Europe, and Christopher Krob Robinson, the Chief Architect of Open Source Security Foundation. And we'll unpack a few of the initiatives that Mirko and Krob are working on concertedly. Stepping back a little minute first, in December, we gathered right here in Amsterdam to host the Stewards and Manufacturers Workshop, jointly between LF Europe and the Open Source Security Foundation. We hosted a workshop for about 50 subject matter experts who gathered to identify gaps and challenges that needed to be closed in terms of our readiness for the CRA. And we guided this discussion and this workshop grouping into three work streams: a standards work stream, where we were discussing how we could formalize best practices, develop compliance models, and create certification pathways for upstream projects, and basically standardize our approach within the EU standardization bodies themselves. We had a tooling work stream that would explore opportunities to advance standardized SBOM generation tools, vulnerability tracking and disclosure platforms, and other types of automation and compliance verification systems, and so on and so forth. The work stream that I had the opportunity to lead was related to awareness. How do we develop the appropriate educational resources and the awareness campaigns within organizations, within industries, and across the open source ecosystem very broadly? What types of resources were needed to accelerate awareness? And how could we best provide information to help advance CRA awareness. One of the things that we discussed very early on at the outset of the workshop in the awareness workstream was testing a hypothesis, sort of asked everybody, what do you think the level of awareness is of the CRA today among different stakeholders? And it was very clear that everybody gathered believed that awareness was incredibly low. And if awareness is low, then readiness and compliance preparedness would also be low. But that was a hypothesis. And, rather than go on conjecture, we wanted to go on empirical evidence. So one of the first things that we kicked off was a study to test this hypothesis and to actually come up with empirical data that would measure our community's readiness for the CRA. So one of the first outcomes we produced in March was a publication on CRA readiness and awareness that in fact confirmed our hypothesis that awareness is incredibly low. We were looking at how the CRA would impact prices of digital products, and whether or not manufacturers had really assessed what the obligations would be. So one of the graphics that I'm showing here, that there's expected to be at least a 6% increase in prices of digital goods by those manufacturers who have even thought about it. A majority, more, just over half, are still assessing what the price impacts of the CRA will be on their organization. This results from the increase of costs of compliance with the CRA, the need to hire security experts, the need to hire additional legal staff and take up more legal resources, which are incredibly costly. Those get passed on. This becomes a barrier to particularly startups and small, medium-sized enterprises in Europe. One of the consequences of regulations, the impact on SMEs. So without further ado, I'm going to really pass over the floor to the true experts here. I'll invite Mirko up to talk about some CRA-related initiatives led by LF Europe. Thank you.
I'm very sorry. We're immediately getting into discussions. I'm seeing this gentleman not often enough, and so, yeah.
Talking during my presentation.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. We were very quiet. So thank you very much. I would like to give an update on, first of all, a high-level overview of what the CRA means for you, and how we think it will affect the relationship between manufacturers and open source foundations. And then a brief overview of the current activities that we're driving at the Linux Foundation, which are, in a way, all triggered by that workshop that Hilary has mentioned. So I hope that the impression that you will get is that we're actively working on this. Let's see. Who are we? We're Linux Foundation Europe, the European chapter of the Linux Foundation. And as such, we are here to grow the regional opportunities for the people in Europe to contribute to Linux Foundation's projects globally. So kind of from here to global. We're helping global projects to establish themselves in Europe, and we represent the Linux Foundation and what we do in European policy discussions, standards development, and funding programs. I am the Director for Community Development and an open source contributor since '97. I think that's enough about me. Where do we stand today with the Cyber Resilience Act? This is a recap slide. You should all have seen this before. You should all be aware of these dates. So the COA was adopted or entered into force on the 10th of December last year. And that means it will apply fully 3 years later, 11th December 2027. And the vulnerability reporting obligations become effective earlier after 21 months, so in Q3 26, basically. This is, Hilary said the clock is ticking, and I'm underlining this here. 3 years is not a long time, and it feels almost like 1 year has passed. And as you will see a little bit later, we're still a little bit in the beginning of the implementation activities. There is a Cyber Resilience Act expert group that has been set up by the European Commission that now advises the the European Commission on the implementation. And maybe what's noteworthy is that the Cyber Resilience Act is the first European Union level regulation that treats the open source ecosystem separate from maintainers, introduces specific roles for organizations like open source foundations, and literally has a chapter headline that says free and open source software in the headline. So I think that's a huge improvement, or a huge win for the open source community. We've been arguing long with regulators that open source is important, that should be treated specifically. Now they do, which is also a little bit scary because we have to handle this. We have to deal with it. Okay, 2 highlights on the Cyber Resilience Act. It introduces 2 distinct roles, manufacturers and open source software stewards. Manufacturers are what you would expect, basically those organizations, companies that commercially bring products with digital elements into the market. And as always, these companies bear the full responsibility for the compliance of their products with applicable standards, including the Cyber Resilience Act. There are some very interesting details in the Cyber Resilience Act that are not discussed enough. One is that it's the manufacturer's responsibility to perform due diligence when they consume open source components. So the open source community provides software to anybody for any purpose, and the manufacturer decides whether or not this component is fit for purpose in this digital product. And that means that the responsibility for cybersecurity of the digital product is with the manufacturer, not with the upstream community. It's a very important detail in the Cyber Resilience Act. Of course, the product is then subject to conformity assessments, and also the manufacturer is liable for security over the lifetime of the product life cycle, and that period is defined to be typically 5 years or more. So this is roughly what manufacturers have to expect. And in contrast to that, we have open source software stewards, which is a very nice term for organized open source communities, including the work of open source foundations. So basically those open source communities that are incorporated, typically as non-profits, where they collaborate and release software without direct commercial intent. Those are open source software stewards. And so we as the Linux Foundation are one, and we are, for example, subject to these requirements. We need to have documented cybersecurity policies. We are encouraged to participate in vulnerability reporting, voluntarily participate in vulnerability reporting, and to coordinate with market surveillance authorities in case there are things like critical security issues like we had in the past with Heartbleed and others. So this is just to give you an overview of what the landscape looks like now with stewards and manufacturers. But this does mean that a few things change or are maybe emphasized in the relationship between open source projects, especially at foundations and manufacturers. Our role as Linux Foundation is to host open source projects under neutral governance. We have a couple of ground rules. For example, everybody who is interested can participate in the technical development of the project. All the trademarks, etc., of the project are owned by the community, by the foundation, so that no single entity can walk away with them. And this is our role. Our role is not to make sure that your product is free of cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And this development usually happens downstream with the manufacturers. So what this means is that if we want to secure open source software, the relationship between the stewards and the manufacturers needs to drive that process. The security patches, the handling of the vulnerabilities needs to be developed downstream and be integrated upstream with the projects. And here's the reminder. Maintainers in our projects usually contribute to that, to technical steering of the projects as an additional role to their day job. So they're usually developers on a product at a manufacturer, and as such, they also agree or participate in development processes in open source projects as contributors and maintainers. And that means their timeline, their workday is not dictated by your release priorities. There's an interesting article that I'm linking here, that is Open Source Maintainers Owe You Nothing, by my good friend Mike McQuaid. And it's a very good read for everybody to understand that you can't impose your product timeline on upstream maintainers. And that means that we need to develop a productive relationship between downstream and upstream to say, if I would like to release my product next week, Wednesday, I need to make sure that the upstream community is able to integrate my patches in time. And I can't force them to. It's a voluntary process. And this means that as a downstream manufacturer, you have a keen interest to identify those projects that are critical to your products and engage in the governance of those projects for two reasons. One is, this way you can shape the actual development processes at that project, and you can influence the viability of the project over the longer term. Because you will have a 5-year or longer product life cycle where you need to maintain your product, it is a critical risk that an important open source component that you depend on just stops development. And that can happen if the community kind of dries out, has not enough contributors. So one of the key influences that we expect the Cyber Resilience Act to have is that manufacturers will move closer to the upstream communities that they depend on and contribute more to them. And we hope, and we are optimistic, that this will help us solve the maintenance and the cybersecurity challenges that some projects face. And that leaves the manufacturers with one piece of homework, and that is to identify your critical components, where you say, these are critical, but I'm maybe worried about their governance or the viability of their communities, and then you can engage with them and make sure that they're getting more healthy. Okay, so basically the call is to move from passive engagement to active engagement. So let's see where we stand with that. So everything until now was basically the overview. Now we're getting into the implementation. Just yesterday, Hilary and her team released this amazing report.
Ta-da!
Ta-da! The Open Source as European Strategic Advantage report, a new instance of the World of Open Source report for Europe. I would like to also use the opportunity to highlight the amazing Hilary research team. Could you please raise your hands? Thank you very much. They are the authors of the report. And one number in that report stands out, key infographic, 62% of the respondents report low familiarity with the Cyber Resilience Act. Now, to any of you who have participated in our previous presentations, does this number look familiar? Yes, it does, because we did a similar review in March and a similar survey, and the number was exactly the same. So we said at the time, the community is unaware and there's a lot of uncertainty. And 6 months down the road, the number hasn't budged. I'm not sure what you're all doing, but you should start reading the Cyber Resilience Act. Hilary tells me that my analysis of this is probably wrong because there's not enough time between the two surveys to actually make a huge difference. But the main message that I would like to give you is time is ticking. Almost 1 year has passed since the Cyber Resilience Act was imposed, and the familiarity numbers are still very low. The two ports, as Hilary said, these are all under Creative Commons licenses and available to you. Linking them here, take pictures, and read them. Some highlights, only 1/3 of manufacturers produce S-bombs in their products, and nearly half of them passively rely on upstream projects for their security fixes. Now, this should raise a little bit of an alarm if you think about it. If you are responsible for due diligence and for the cybersecurity posture of your products, and you're passively waiting for upstream communities to fix the cybersecurity issue that was found, these two things don't go well together. Right? And this is why I said earlier that we need to have a closer relationship between the manufacturers and the upstream projects in the development process. Luckily, another report that we published also in March highlights that some open source projects are actually quite well prepared to deal with cybersecurity requirements. So we did 3 case studies here with the Civil Infrastructure Platform, the Zephyr project, and the Yocto project, and basically compared the requirements of the Cyber Resilience Act with what the projects are doing. The outcome is great. These projects have taken cybersecurity very serious for a very long time, and I would say they're probably role models. So, for example, Civil Infrastructure Platform has a 10-year maintenance window. Zephyr runs their own CNA. So do others by now. Yocto has reproducible builds. Why am I saying this? Because these are open source projects, both in licensing and in governance. That means you can go and understand and research how these projects are doing that, how they're handling cybersecurity, and you can learn from that and see which of these processes are applicable in your companies, because this is open source and we can all learn from each other. So I really recommend this report, not just because I participated in it, but also because it's really a great resource for what are projects thinking about when it comes to cybersecurity, what are the challenges they face, and where do they shine. So when you learn from the manufacturers that are pretty actively engaged already, then you can take away a few recommendations. They very actively assess the security posture of their open source dependencies. They don't blindly consume from upstream. They maintain comprehensive software bills of material. They develop the internal capability to maintain components that are critical to them. There's often discussion about, does your company have open source maintainers? And this isn't some altruistic motive or ask that you should also contribute to the open source ecosystem. This should be a business need for you, because you need to make sure that your critical components are secure, and the best way to do that is to have people that you either contract or that work on your staff that are able to patch the vulnerabilities that you find and contribute those changes upstream. And the companies that are leading, they build up this capacity. And that's one of the main reasons to participate in upstream development. It's a knowledge transfer mechanism. It tells you how the software works that you're putting in your product. And your engineers learn to fix it, basically. They contribute their security fixes upstream, and they support the long-term viability of the projects that they depend on. Yeah, so I'm speeding up a bit because Corp also wants some time. I would like to highlight a few activities at the Linux Foundation. There is a standards development, a standardization request by the European Commission regarding the Cyber Resilience Act. What is important to understand here is that many of the implementation details of the Cyber Resilience Act will actually be defined in those standards. They act as a high-level law. It's very generic. And the standard, the standardization request contains details like what are the standards for designing, developing, and producing products that have an appropriate level of cybersecurity, or standards that say how do we handle vulnerabilities. And the European Commission has submitted this standardization request to the European standardization organizations. And two deadlines here. The two that I have just mentioned are supposed to be written by August 26, and the rest by October 27. Now, if you think a little bit back a few slides, you realize that the timing is particular. Those standards come into effect just weeks before the deadline for the Cyber Resilience Act passes. So that's another reason for you to take home to your organizations that you should research this and be aware when the standards are coming up, and ideally look at the draft standards already, because that gives you a bit more time to react. So, long story short, the standardization activities here are important. They will contain most of the details on the Cyber Resilience Act, and they're ongoing now. And the Linux Foundation is building up the engagement there. So, in the CRA expert group that we have just mentioned, that I've mentioned in the earlier slides, we have two experts. One is Greg Cage from the Linux kernel team, which I think is a very good representation of the Linux Foundation. And the other one is Madeline, who is sitting there. Who is also a very good representation of the Linux Foundation because he works in the OpenSSF. So we are in this group. This group advises the European Commission, so I think we have a good influence there to make sure that things go in the right direction. We launched a learning course, an express learning course with Linux Foundation Education. It's a free course. It is called Understanding the EU Cyber Resilience Act. And if you haven't taken it yet, and you're one of the people who were wondering when I said 62%, maybe you want to take this course. It only takes 2 hours. I just want to highlight that this course was put together in very short time by a very engaged team, and it's like a one-hit wonder on the charts. It went from 0 to first place in Linux Foundation education courses participation in no time. So it's very popular. You want to take it. Linux Foundation Europe became a member of ETSI. You may have seen in the prior slide that ETSI is one of the European Standards Development Organizations that is working on the Cyber Resilience Act standards. And so we now set up a structure where through Linux Foundation, through Linux Foundation Europe, all Linux Foundation projects that are relevant to these standards development activities can participate in those working groups. This is great. We are also establishing partnerships with Sensenelec and NISA. That's work in progress, and we're already participating in the European multi-stakeholder platform on ICT standardization, which is an advisory expert group that the European Commission has appointed that kind of drives ICT standards development activities. So you see that we're taking this very seriously, and we're making progress with establishing a strong presence in this space. Still, standards development is not necessarily something that comes natural to open source foundations or to open source contributors. But I think we're taking steps here that are really substantial compared to what happened in the last decades, where there was a lot of debate between standards development and open source and how do we do this. And that's all I wanted to say, and I would like to hand over to Crow for many more details. Thank you.
Many? Thanks a lot. Hey, everybody. How are we doing today? I'm Crow. I do security stuff on the internet. I am the Chief Security Architect for the Open Source Security Foundation. I've been doing cybersecurity for about 30 or so years, and I've been doing upstream open source coordinated vulnerability disclosure for about 15 years. I'm the least interesting person in this room. I have come up through heavily regulated industries. I worked in U.S. financial for about 7 years, healthcare and insurance. Cybersecurity legislation has existed, and depending on where you are in the world, case law has existed for about 100 years that is still applicable today. We had a lot of interest in the 80s, where we had the U.S. wiretap laws, and internationally, this is just kind of a sampling. I know it's an eye chart. We'll have these slides if you're interested. But you see, governments have been concerned about hacking or breaking in or stealing information for a very long time. And as we moved into the digital era, this has really greatly accelerated. Broadly internationally, the Biden administration, when they released the Executive Order 1428, improving the U.S.'s cybersecurity, that really kind of woke up a lot of folks internationally. And we've seen just and actually, I would say even before that, GDPR was probably one of the most landmark things historically that really kind of shifted international attitudes about how customer data and privacy is handled. And then we got into more of the cyber area, and then the CRA came about. They've been working on this for several years, and this is probably one of the most comprehensive pieces of legislation that I've had the opportunity to read 5 times. It's great. And what I love about it, and it's weird to say I love a law, but what I love about it is I've been a practicing cyber person for decades, and the law codifies exactly what I've been advocating to my developers, to my business partners for almost 3 decades. It's secure by design, secure by default, understanding security architecture, threat modeling, all these kind of basic 101 style things. The newest requirement in the CRA is SBOMs. I have been working with my friend Alan Friedman and the global SBOM community for 8 years, so I really don't think that's new anymore either. But this is just kind of a sampling. And this, you'll see this governments in Asia, Australia, South America. Everyone is very interested in thinking about this because of attacks like Log4Shell or the XZ Utilities attack. Governments are taking this very seriously, and they're looking to protect their citizens. Mirko went over some of this, and I'm going to blast through these things since we have a limited amount of time. But if you want to take a look at Article 64, if you are a manufacturer, this talks about the penalties of non-compliance. It is substantial. You are thinking about billions of euros for each incident. If you're non-compliant, number 4 here is if you supply the commission or the MSA incorrect or falsified information, there's penalties for that. That's just 1% of your global annual turnover. Huge consequences for manufacturers. And as we mentioned, upstream developers are not required to do this. They can be helpful, and generally as software engineers, they want their projects to have high levels of quality and broad adoption downstream, but the developers aren't on the hook for any of this. Asterisks, because there's some nuances in the law, like if you are taking money for a project, like through donations or grants, there's some clauses around making a profit. But broadly, the majority, millions of open source maintainers, don't have an obligation. They may choose to or already be helpful, but they aren't on the hook. As Mirko mentioned, that's 62% of folks were not familiar or slightly familiar. I hope sessions like this help us get to a point where you are able to kind of be our advocates and ambassadors and go to your organizations, go to your communities that you might operate under, and help them learn about how this is going to interact. Did anyone get to see Daniel's keynote yesterday? Amazing talk. Daniel is not affiliated with any foundation, but we view him in the OpenSSF as kind of the canary in the coal mine. He takes security and the reputation of his project incredibly seriously. He does a lot of really great security things, but he's not your supplier. You get your supplier through automotive manufacturers or commercial Linux distributions or routers or switches. Those are the folks that have those obligations. And you saw through Daniel's narrative, those are the entities that are harassing him, demanding things that he isn't necessarily required to do. And that's where we hope that you all can educate yourselves, educate your organizations, and educate the maintainers that you work with. We've done a lot of actions. As Hilary mentioned, we had the Stewards of Manufacturers Workshop last year in Amsterdam. We had the amazing reports that came out with our partnership with LF Research and LF Europe. We're planning additional follow-up reports for next year. And what I did, being the subject matter experts in security broadly for the Linux Foundation, we have started to coalesce a community. We've created a working group, the Global Cyber Policy Working Group. This is a free and open and public meeting. Anyone that is interested in these topics about regulation and cybersecurity frameworks around the world, you're welcome to attend. Predominantly, it's about the CRA because that's the most interesting, most prescient thing right now. But as laws come online in India or Korea, China, we will have those conversations there and facilitate meetings. We have a working group meeting in person almost right after this, upstairs in room 402. If you're a LF member, why aren't you already going to be there? If you're not, you're welcome to kind of come in and listen. We'll be talking about these things. We have some presentations from some really interesting community members talking about their experiences with the CRA so far. And we have focus groups working on the awareness topic where we do a lot of education. I'll be working with a member to write a risk assessment class. One of the requirements of the law is you do have to do risk assessments. So we're going to take Anissa's model and then the work that's being done in Sensenelec and Etsy and kind of educate our community on how upstream could do a very light risk assessment, and then as a manufacturer, what they're looking for, what the paperwork you have to hand into them might look like. And then we do tooling, and then the standardization. We have talks about that. A lot of resources available to you. I invite you to take a look at it. We have a very active GitHub repo. We have a web page where we do a blog series. We've done webinars and podcasts. We did an amazing podcast talk with Jonathan. He is the security developer in residence for the Erlang language community. And through our partnership with a group called Alpha and Omega, we were able to help fund him as a resource for that community. And also that joined us on the podcast was a gentleman by the name of Ulf. He represents a German manufacturer that they heavily leverage Erlang, and they got into this. They recognized Erlang was critical to their business, so they are also participating in helping fund Jonathan's work because it helps them be compliant. Let's see here, the one-on-one class. We also have a project called the Open Source Project Security Baseline. This is a internationally informed list of requirements that is based under compliance frameworks and laws. So if you follow NIST 800-161, or the NIST SSDF, the Secure Software Development Framework, or you like the CRA, or you like PCI DSS, we align these requirements to all of these compliance regimes and laws. So we show, for example, if a project uses multi-factor authentication for their developers to commit things, we show you all the tick boxes you can get in your compliance regime. So those are targets for upstream maintainers to potentially deliver, but it's also a checklist for downstream. When you're evaluating open source software, take a look at this as a model with which you can potentially have a better means to ingest software. This is an example of what the crosswalk looks like. It's incredibly exciting. Spreadsheets, yay. We've done policy summits. We're doing another policy summit in Brussels next month, where we'll be talking October, sorry. We'll be talking with the commission, the expert group, the standardization folks, and we'll have our membership and community members there to kind of have a dialogue back and forth. And with that, I think we are ready to have a little chat together.
Well done, Crow. Well done. Want to take audience questions? Yeah, all right. So now it's your turn, and Peter's got his hand up first, so.
Yeah, question to Rob. In the previous session, we talked about public funding for open source projects, for instance, for projects that are maintained by just a single or two maintainers, which cannot make a living. But now, if they would receive public funding, they would have some kind of income, and you shortly alluded to that. What does it mean from the CRA point of view? Would that make them to software provider bringing software into the European market so that they would have to fulfill all this, or is it still covered by the exemption that we normally have for them?
So I skipped my slide. I'm not a lawyer. More directly, I'm not your lawyer, and I don't work for the commission. So my impression is, depending on what that project does, if they go underneath a steward, or if they set up some type of legal entity with protections around themselves, they may still not be compliant. But again, you want to consult with a lawyer to get the specifics, because once you hit that level of where you're making a profit, my impression is the commission is it's going to be fairly black and white. You did make a profit or you didn't. Mirko, do you have a more thorough answer from your perspective?
I would give an answer. I'm also not a lawyer, but I would still say it depends, because that's what lawyers say. I think that the organizations that will hand out such funding will actually probably have a framework for how that should be managed. One thing is, if you're supporting an individual developer, the CRA excludes that as long as that developer is not monetizing the work. So if we pay a person just enough to not starve and to maintain a project, that should be fine. If there's like, for example, if the framework is different and we need a legal entity around this, then of course open source foundations can help. But I think this is definitely, your question is pointed at an important issue. This is something that, as we are managing funding for open source organizations or maintainers, something that in the future needs to be considered, so that we don't put them in a bad spot and make them manufacturers. So.
And there are organizations doing this today, like Germany's Tech Sovereign Agency, used to be the Tech Sovereign Fund, a great organization. And there are others, both within the union and internationally, that are thinking about that. You might want to have a conversation with them with how their model works and how their perspective on what that might mean to maintainers for accepting grants and donations.
Hi, thank you for the interesting discussion. My name is Andreas Tille, I'm the current Debian project leader, and if I understood you correctly, then Debian as a community is more or less safe. On the other hand, our downstreams might be not safe, and we also care for our downstreams. Do we have some, well, actually, we are mostly technicians, and we have no real fun to do this. I'm including myself into this. Do you have any hints what we can do?
So first, sorry, Krob, I'm going to take the first stab at this. When you say you're safe, do you expect not to be influenced by the CRA? You use the word safe. So, yeah. So when I hear safe, there are two possible understandings, right? It's safe in terms of the software is secure, or safe in I'm not going to be harmed by this. liable, basically. I think, first of all, you mentioned the Debian project, and the Debian project is a community organization, it's not incorporated. So I think you're probably a special case because you're one of the very large community organizations that are still not incorporated. So I would actually talk to a lawyer if you're still like not considered a steward. I'm not a lawyer, I cannot answer you this question. I think the typical 1 to 5 maintainers project that is just a loose collaboration on the internet, that's what the Commission had in mind here. A global collaboration of hundreds of developers is not the typical model for individual volunteer developers. There are lawyers here in the room who may want to talk about this. So your downstream, that really depends on how the communities or the companies are set up there. If it's an incorporated community, it would be a steward probably. If it's an individual developer, they're exempt. Again, I think these questions are so specific to the individual situation that you need to consult with a lawyer on this, just to make sure that you're doing the right thing.
And then we're working on a couple resources that we will be publicly sharing. It's focused around the stewardship role, which again, may or may not fit your case specifically, but it could be good guidance that you might want to take a look at. We're going to have a one-page guide, a checklist of what things stewards should do, and then we're going to have a more in-depth playbook on how to implement things like software bill of materials or vulnerability reporting. So we'll have those publicly available on our GitHub repo probably in the next month.
So that was our timer, that we are officially out of time. And I know there's 2 questions. Timo, I see you, and I see Mirko here as well. Mirko did have his hand up first, so if you can ask very quickly, and we can try to address it very quickly as well.
Yeah, my name is Mirko, another Mirko from the Sovereign Tech Agency. I have a question to the role of the Linux Foundation in that CIA game. So I hear a lot that with the upcoming CIA, there is a wish of the foundation stepping in to become more kind of a hinge between industry and the maintainers. And my question to the Linux Foundation is, how do you want to step in order to use your industry connections, your industry members, to actually facilitate or like use the CIA to actually, process more money into the actually maintainers community? And because most foundations, not speaking too much of Linux Foundation, but also like Apache Software Foundation and all the others, they are not specifically known for actually funding implementation work. They do a lot of governance work and like, creating this umbrella that I think the community is very grateful for, but actually funding maintainers is not their role, has been not their role. And I ask you, as one of those foundations, how do you see your role evolving now that the CIA is coming into force?
Good question, Mirko. Thank you. It might be disappointing to hear, but we still do not see ourselves as an organization that hires the maintainers. We are the host of projects. We hire almost no developers. Only in exceptional cases, like Linux Torvalds, who works full-time for us, and we basically let him run and work on the kernel. This will not change. So our role is not to be the actual development entity. How the role will change is that we are working with the manufacturers to set up projects that are well maintained. And for those projects that are very visible, these are projects with a lot of industry engagement, and they do the development and they fund the project's upkeep, basically. This is the part that I think matches very well with the Cyber Resilience Act setup and where we will continue our work. The more difficult part are unfunded projects and individual maintainers outside of our foundations. And there are many of them. The Linux Foundation, about 1/3 of our projects are not receiving funding. We're just hosting them as technical projects. And their development has to be done by maintainers. And we also don't have the means to basically we don't have people that we can assign to the projects. So this is something where we have to work with the manufacturers, but also with the communities. And it's also a case-by-case situation, not specific, not generic to all of them.
And we partner with Alpha and Omega, who's a good partner of the STA, STF. We have some ideas of how we can marshal our members who are predominantly manufacturers, not exclusively, but predominantly. So they're providing means for them to get in touch with the projects that they care about and provide them support, whether that's blood, sweat, and tears, chopping wood, carrying water, if it's infrastructure, cloud credits, or potentially funding. So we have a lot of tools in the tool bag, but like Mirko said, we're not set up to provide directed funding at this time, but all options are on the table, and if my members are interested in doing something, we can absolutely try to help. We have a lot of ways that we can help facilitate that, and a lot of amazing industry partners. So, and thank you for all your work.
So thank you, everybody, for your questions. I'd like to conclude with an invitation to please reach out to us to get involved. There is a positive correlation between engagement in open source software communities and your organization's risk management profile in terms of cybersecurity risk, as well as regulation risk. So stay in touch with us, and thank you so much for attending today. Wish you a wonderful afternoon.